Welcome to Leading Through Stories. This is season 2. Today it's just Mary and I, as well as our guest. Usually we have Helen Rose with us, who's passionate about grief, but she is not feeling 100%. So we're sending all our love that way to Helen. And today you get Mary Michaelithes, who's an educational leader, and me, Christy Wolf, and I believe there's power in stories. For those of you joining us for the first time, look down into the show notes to find out why we started Leading Through Stories, who we are, what this is all about. Our guest today is Heather Patterson. I'm going to pull her in the stream. And we'll be talking with Heather about her work documenting life in hospital during the COVID pandemic. Heather, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So excited to have you join us today, Heather. So Heather is an adult and pediatric emergency physician and an award-winning photographer from Calgary, Alberta. So exciting that you're local. Yay! When the pandemic struck, Heather decided to put her 20 years of photography experience to use and began photography in looking at the intimate moments at the Calgary hospitals that she went to. And as we looked at her resource, her book, Shadows and Light, we're so excited for you to share your perspective with us. She's actively involved in education and mentorship of medical residents and believes in the importance of authenticity and vulnerability for creating a community that fosters career longevity. Can't wait to have our conversation with you, Heather. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thanks, Mary.
I feel like we always give Mary the tough job of reading the bio without trying to look at the screen, which like nobody can do.
So hard, right?
Oh man, yeah. So Heather, we believe everyone is a leader from where they stand and that everyone has a story to tell. Tell us how you started documenting life in hospital.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a roundabout story. And to be honest, I never expected it to come to producing a book and being involved in all of these different opportunities, speaking with people about my experience. This project started because I was feeling burnt out. And in our medical culture, we tell no one about that. I think it's changing a bit because now we're having quite a pervasive problem with healthcare worker burnout. But in January of 2020, I had kind of hit the wall. And I was at a place where I had to do something or leave medicine. And it was a really difficult place to be. Number one, I wasn't telling anyone about it other than my husband, who's also an emergency physician, because it felt like a failure. And failure is not something we do well in general, and certainly not in medicine. So if someone asked me how I was doing, I would say, I'm fine, carry on. You know, I have all these different rules and clinical and non-clinical rules within the hospital system, and you just don't admit that. But I reached a point where there was nowhere else I could go. I had to start addressing what I was experiencing. And it was actually my husband who, one night as we were brainstorming what to do about this experience of burnout and where I would go with my career next, and he suggested photographing in hospital. And photography for me has always been a way of reframing, re-engaging, reconnecting. And so, it caught my attention, but at that point I was certainly feeling quite pessimistic and didn't think that anyone would ever allow me to bring a camera into the hospital. But my husband, being the wonderful human he is, was just like, just sit on it. See what you think. And the next morning, I promised him that I'd write an academic proposal to photograph in the emergency department. The ironic part about this is that the pandemic hadn't even struck yet. And so my project was specifically looking to address what we were doing in the emergency department. I wanted to create a visual reminder of the purpose and privilege of practicing medicine. And without telling anyone why that I was burnt out and that it was as much for me as the rest of my department, I carried on with this project. And as I finally got approval after going through many layers of AHS leadership and communication, I finally received approval to photograph in the hospital. And that was in November of 2020, right in the kind of coming up to the peak of the second wave of COVID. And so that's where it all started. And as I was in the hospital photographing, I think, again, that use of photography for me was very apparently changing my perspective. I could see things, reframe how I was seeing this challenging time. And so that's how it all started.
Boy, Mary, I'm going to jump in.
Okay, go ahead.
I have to. There's so many things that as she's talking,
I'm jumping in. That
So,
was my turn.
okay, Mary, you go.
No, go ahead.
All right. So, as a photographer, Heather's work immediately, as I started seeing it come up throughout the pandemic, because she was posting, but also Alberta Health Services was posting about images and the pandemics, like just different images from across Alberta Health Services. And so I started learning more about Heather's work at that time. And as a photographer, I loved it because this is what I do with my own family, talking about reframing it. Mental health and photography for me go hand in hand. But the flip side of it is when, Heather, you were talking about physicians not talking about their mental health. This is also the backstory of a lot of what I do and what I talk about is with my dad, who was a cardiologist, died by suicide. Mental health was not a topic we talked about. And when all of those things went down for us about 8 years ago, our family started talking about mental health, and the number of healthcare providers that came out and started talking about there was no place to turn, not wanting to share the story of what was going on. So both of those sides of things, the photography, but also the hiding burnout, really stood out for me. Okay, Mary, it's your turn.
It is a difficult thing, though, to experience burnout and feel so isolated. And truly, I mean, there are resources out there for healthcare workers who are experiencing burnout. But when you're in the throes of feeling miserable and not feeling connected to what you've dedicated your life to, you don't want to talk about it. You don't want to tell anyone. So it certainly is a difficult place to be. And Christy, I'm so sorry about your family's experiences. I mean, what a horrendous thing to go through. We know it happens, but I can't imagine to be in that personally. So I'm really sorry.
Well, it has opened our eyes to that. And I think that every member of my family now is more open talking about and telling stories about my dad, but it's also led to connections with different people. And so I do find that people generally apologize and like, that's like what you would expect, but I think it also makes space for other people to tell stories. So what you've done with your book, same idea. It makes space for the people in that book who see those visuals, but also people who aren't in that book. There's so many, I was telling Mary, there's so many stories about like your introduction is all about your own life and exactly what you talked about. Kind of feeling that burnout, trying to find a project. Like you very openly share those stories in your book as well, which it's incredible. I think this should be like required reading for medical students personally, but we'll have to work on that maybe.
Yeah, exactly. But it is a hard thing to put out there. I would say that when the book, I got my first copy of it before it was on the shelves. They sent me a copy and I opened it and I went, oh dear, did I actually write all of that down? Everybody's now going to read this. But I think you're right. It opens a space to have those conversations. It allows people not to feel as isolated in their experience because now you have a physician who's putting it out there.
So you know what, Heather, I'm thinking about this conversation. There are two things that come to mind. First, good on you to be innovative and creative and to kind of say to Alberta Health Services, I want to bring the camera in for a number of reasons. I mean, that in itself probably was a mountain that you needed to move. So I, thank you for that. And secondly, as we think about your book and the images that come to life, and there's one behind you, I can see that. We'll get to that shortly, I'm sure. But what specific advice? So this is a selfish conversation. I'm helping prep a student who has been invited to submit an application for med school, so they're preparing for their interview. And secondly, I have a godson that has just been a successful recipient of a position in a hospital in Alberta, not far from you, just a little bit around the corner. What advice would you give to our new physicians who are coming into the profession as we take a look at some of the key words that you talked about, burnout that we don't talk about, that network of community that is so important? Like, what advice would you give?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things. So going into medical school and residency is a challenging time. You're immersed in this new culture. And I think the first step is understanding who you are. You are unique and you have the opportunity to create this incredible community and career. but you need to stay true to yourself. You need to be authentic and remember who you are and carry that through. There's lots of challenges that you will encounter as a medical trainee, but I think the first thing is being grounded in your unique skills. You don't need to assimilate, you can grow, but remembering who you are. I think the second thing that's incredibly important is authenticity. And so recognizing that as you walk through the challenging experiences and the incredible experiences of growing to become a physician and caring for people, you need to have insight into how you're doing. And if you have those times and those challenging cases, because we all have them, we will all witness tragedy in our careers, and it can be profoundly difficult. Different cases affect different people, but you need to remember that you're not alone. And you need to be able to have real conversations with people you trust, find ways to debrief, to support each other, and to find ways to manage what we see and what we do on a daily basis in healthy ways. Not just bundling it up and not dealing with it, shoving it into the closet of your soul for another time. You need to remember that you're human. It's okay to feel things. You can set those emotions aside when you need to, because we often do, but remembering to take that time to debrief them, deal with that emotional experience, and then have a community of people that you can speak openly and honestly about your experiences.
Thank you.
That's great advice. So you do work with like new staff and you have mentoring. What is this the kind of like, was that the spiel that you usually do?
Yeah, you know what? I talk to people all the time. I will share my difficult cases. I'll talk about the ones that will bother me forever, and I talk about my coping strategies now, what I've realized, what I've learned, and how I've changed my pattern of coping in order to have a healthier response to the trauma. It is not easy witnessing some of the things that we are a part of, and to be involved not just as physicians, but we're supporting those families, and each story rings true for different people, and you see the similarities between those that you're caring for and the people in your own life. And so, I share a lot with my trainees now in the hopes that by being authentic, by being vulnerable with my own experience, by having these discussions, that it will help promote a change in our culture and promote healthcare worker wellness.
Well, and I have to assume that people in like the older generation is not doing this yet. That there is very much a difference between people coming into medicine and what they're willing to talk about versus the old guard, if you will.
It's interesting. I still think there's quite variability. I think you'll find physicians in all demographics who are moving towards that different mentorship and authenticity and vulnerability. So it's hard to say. I think you're right. Our younger generation are more open to those discussions. But it's still, our culture is difficult. We are expected to be strong. I can have a pediatric death, which is an awful thing to be a part of, and support that family. And then I still have to keep working, right? So 15, 20 minutes later, I'm at the bedside of someone with a cold. And so you have to have that ability to rally. But it's just a difficult place to be sometimes.
And compartmentalize. Go ahead, Mary. I don't need to keep talking. You go.
But I like the word compartmentalize. I think that's an important concept, right? Mm-hmm. How do you do that? Otherwise, it can suck you into that dark vortex very quickly.
Yeah, so we have to compartmentalize. I think that's one of the skills that we teach, is how to be objective when you're standing at the foot of the bed in a critical resuscitation. I can't be feeling the weight of that emotional response in the moment. I have to have clarity of thought. I have to make difficult decisions. I need to lead the team. And so I can't stand there and experience the sadness, the tragedy of what is unfolding in front of me. I need to have that clarity. So compartmentalization is a major part of what we do as physicians, nurses, healthcare workers. But for me, it's now about taking that experience and debriefing it later. Whereas before, I would take that experience and it would be so uncomfortable and often so emotional that I just didn't want to feel it at all. I didn't think it was appropriate to feel it, but I certainly didn't want to feel it. It felt better to just medicalize and have that as a, yes, this was a cardiac arrest in, this patient, and these are the things we did, and good job, team. We did a great job with this resuscitation. You were great with your communication. You were great with your medications. Excellent job. And that's it. But it's a whole other kettle of fish to then say, that really was awful. How are you coping? Are you doing okay? Can I support you? Right? Or have someone say that to you. It's an uncomfortable place to be as a physician.
How do your images inform your conversations or your next steps? I mean, the book is beautiful. The stories are remarkable. Tell us a little bit about that. What does that book that you created so beautifully do for you?
Well, I think the book, the process of making the book was as impactful as having that as a reminder, looking back at it. So from a process perspective, I think that creating those images, engaging in those stories without the weight of clinical responsibility. I never photographed any of my own patients. I never photographed at the same time as I was working clinically. And so having that separate role actually allowed me to start feeling in a place that I had so actively tried not to feel for years. And I think that really opened me up to better understand who I am, what I need, how to connect better with my patients and families, but also how to debrief those cases more appropriately. And moving forward with that, it again allows me to be more present as a physician for my patients. I think it's helped me grow and develop in a way that I can be the best I can, providing medical, but also compassionate care for my families. Looking back at the book, so it's interesting because anytime I look back at any photographs, my family, my friends, or these images from the pandemic, it allows me to reflect back and really consolidate that learning, but also to remember those things, right? It creates a different type of memory for me. And looking at the pandemic, we are always so forward moving in medicine. We're always, especially in the emergency department, moving on to the next crisis. And so looking back at those pandemic images for me has been really important because I remember how it felt. I remember how we were successful. I remember the challenges. And I think for me moving forward, again, it really emphasizes how incredible the team is that I work with and helps me be grateful on a daily basis that I'm a part of that team, even though we went through such challenging times.
I think it's really powerful to get to show the other people that you photograph those images. But I also loved that you have a variety of stories. So some of them are patient stories, some of them are healthcare and physician specific, but other stories were like the variety of members of a team that would be involved. And so that was actually my favorite part, that you had spent time with janitorial staff and you got stories from all of these different perspectives on what was happening. What was that like? Because that probably, I mean, you mentioned it in the book, but spending time and talking to somebody after an event has happened in a room and then the cleanup and all of those kinds of things, did that change your perspective?
Absolutely. The project really unfolded. Like I mentioned at the beginning, the project at the beginning was really centered on healthcare workers. And as I was photographing healthcare workers and having time and space to be curious, to observe what was happening, I saw all these parts that I was missing. I had a wonderful photography mentor who worked through this project with me. And one of the things she suggested was to stop being a physician, show up for a resuscitation 30 minutes earlier, stay 30 minutes later, and see who you're missing and recognize, what else was going on other than my own little perspective. And there was a day when I was photographing everybody putting on their PPE. And I was like, oh my goodness, we have gone through so many gowns. And I realized I'd never recognized who is getting us these gowns. Where was the place in the hospital? Who were they? What were the challenges they were facing? So I marched my way down to the basement of the hospital and introduced myself. And I met this incredible group of committed people. And with the stories as I met them, I realized that I really had been more focused on what we do in our clinical zones and not taking the time to express gratitude and thanks to the people who are helping make it happen. And the hospital is a hierarchical place. I don't like hierarchy. One of the reasons I work in the emergency department is because we are a true team. There is less hierarchy there than in other areas of the hospital. I learn from all of our staff, and I value their clinical acumen and input at all points during my time in the emergency department. But I hadn't taken that same time to acknowledge the non-clinical support staff. And so I loved it. I thought it was fabulous. I reached out to the leadership of AHS and I said, give me a list of all the departments of non-clinical staff. And I made a point of going to each area and learning how they were addressing the challenges they faced in the pandemic. And it was incredible. I mean, stories of excellence and sacrifice and innovation, they were everywhere. And that really promoted a sense of gratitude for me. And again, helped me work through that experience of feeling burnt out. Gratitude is a huge component of that for me, is learning how to be thankful and appreciate all the members of our team.
Christy, it kind of reminds me of our message from Dr. Lisa Belanger when she talked about burnout and how actually the gratitude piece really prevents that. And, as I listen to you this afternoon, Heather, some of the work that I'm doing is in response to leadership, but you are a lift leader. From where you stand right now, as I think about you talking to Alberta Health Services, and I want to take a look at the non-clinical staff. Who are they? That must be a very lifting opportunity, not only for you, but also for the staff that you came into contact with, for them to recognize there's a doctor out there that actually cares about where these gowns come from, or even if we have these gowns. And I get goosebumps just listening to you, just saying, so thank you for being a lift leader for sure.
Oh, thank you. It is neat though. I love going to work now because I know all of our housekeepers' names. I know about their families. I know the lab staff and the ECG techs and the maintenance guys. And I love it because now I can go to work and say, how are you? And how are things going? Thank you for what you're doing today. Can I grab you anything? And it really has broadened my sense of team and gratitude on a daily basis. So I think it's been an incredible experience for me. And I hope that the images that I created of these people help other people see as well.
Yeah. Well, so two things on that. I have to assume that this is only a small collection of your images in your book, right? Like you had to pick and choose. What do you do with all the rest of them?
Yeah, so I'm working on that because I took way too many images. I mean, if there's such a thing. So I'm trying to think here. I did 38,000 images during the pandemic, the peak of the pandemic. And then I've been photographing on the pediatric side now for a couple of months, really since our pediatric viral surge has happened. And so I've got another 7,000 there. And then I've been doing some staff PPE portraits. So each person has an opportunity to have a memento of what they looked like during that time in all of their PPE, which is super fun. But what do I do with them? So the way that I structured my consent process and the general process with Alberta Health Services is that I own those images. But for me, they don't feel like my images. They feel like they belong to the people who've participated. So I share them because I think it's very important that they can see who they are in their work and they can see my perspective of who they are, their excellence, their compassion, their kindness, their technical prowess. And so having those images and being able to give them to share with their own families, I love that. And I think it's an important part of the project.
That's a huge part. It was kind of one of the things I always put into photographing when I worked with any kind of medical family was just that even if, or with a nonprofit, if I'm taking photos of families, they get access to those photos. It's not the nonprofit's photos kind of idea.
That's right.
So I really love that you do that as well. The other part I was going to ask,
So Christy, it kind of reminds me of, the photos that you took, in your career when you were an educator years ago. And when I walked into the school and saw the images, displayed throughout, the hallways, and it actually spoke of a narrative. You were telling your story of the school that you worked with, and those images from somebody coming in really stood out for me. I started to make up my own stories based on what I saw on those walls. And it kind of reminds me of the work that you do now, Christy, as a medical mom, and Heather, some of the work that you're doing. you've put images out there for the recipients like me to create a bit of a visual narrative of where I am and what that does for me as a mom, as a partner, as a patient, possibly. And so,
Mhm.
yeah, thank you for that, Christy and Heather.
Aw, thanks, Mary. So, okay, Heather, where, if people want to get your book, and I'm just going to show it again, Shadows and Light, where would they find this? Where's the best
So a
place?
variety of places. So Indigo is probably easiest because it's across the country, but I do love supporting local businesses. And so there are quite a number of small bookstores, independent bookstores across the country who are selling the book. So if you have a favorite bookstore that you would like to support, I would say always call them first, but you can find it on Indigo and Amazon as well.
And I know Cafe Books here in Canmore has it. I've seen it every time I walk in there. Is there anywhere, Mary's in Edmonton, is there anywhere in Edmonton that you can think of off the top of your head?
I don't know which small bookstores, independent bookstores have it there, but
Okay.
I do know that Indigo carries it. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. And then if we wanted to do like a take back, bring back with our audience, with our newsletter that we send out, is there anything that you want to leave them with, thinking about how they can do something like this in their own life? Maybe it's part of that teamwork piece, because that kind of came up over and over, which really resonated for me in healthcare. I hope as you continue to mentor students and talk about the team in emergency and like how, as you're moving into education, maybe I'm doing the take back, bring back right now, I don't know. But when you move into these roles, getting to know the people that are the support staff, and kind of widening your view from just the team that you might be working with specifically to who else is there as a part of that team. What would you say? Take back, bring back.
So
what do you want people to work with?
do I get two? Because I do agree
You
that
can
we
have as
talk a
many
lot
as you
about.
want.
Oh, good. So we talk a lot about teamwork, and there is definitely a focus on that. And I think that's applicable to any business environment, any teamwork environment, is really finding ways to acknowledge and be grateful for all the different members of your team. You know, there's hierarchy in so many different structures, but I think that we can create a better community with less hierarchy, starting with gratitude and appreciation, acknowledgement of what people are doing. I think it's really important, and I hope that we can all move forward with that. One of the other big take homes for me with this project was learning to be intentional with my self-talk and my observation. So with my photography, I saw incredible moments of compassion and kindness. I saw moments of joy and celebration, despite what was happening in the pandemic, which, you know, was a devastating time for so many people. And what I learned is that if I am looking for those moments, they are there. There are moments that you can find every day, every shift in the hospital, every encounter. There are moments of goodness, kindness, compassion. Those moments you can really celebrate. And on those dark days, the days that are tricky, having even just one of those moments being a parent can really change your whole experience. And so I think one of the big take homes that we can apply again to anyone in any environment is don't forget to look for those moments, because they are there and they are worth acknowledging. And that can really change your personal narrative, your self-talk, right? Rather than being like, man, this is a terrible day. This is so hard. Wow. You know, in our environment, the wait times are so long. That consultant wasn't very kind to me. Now I can say, you know what? That encounter with that patient was incredible. I learned from this person X, Y, or Z, or my teammate did an exceptional job, and recognizing that. And that can really shift how we talk to ourselves about our life and our daily experience.
Well, Mary, that makes me think of who you work with educational leaders, and just the burnout that has happened there as well. And was there anything that you were taking away from this whole conversation that would be more specific to education?
So, Christy, interesting, you know, whether it's education, medicine, non-for-profit, I think the nugget that you just left us with is, where do we see the light even when there's darkness? And how do we reinforce that? And not to ignore the darkness, because that's the reality, but where do we see that nugget of light? How do we model, you know, that whole notion of gratitude and thankfulness and lifting of others, and not to forget, Christy, thank you for that question. And then I have a question for you, Heather. How do you lift yourself? I mean, you're so good about lifting others, all clinical, non-clinical, those that you work with, those that you encounter, how do you lift you is my question. And that's a question that I just asked a group of principals just yesterday. And it was interesting to see the pause and kind of, oh my God. And then we had to dig deep. Like, what is it that you're intentional about in lifting you yourself? And Christy, you're in that as well. Like, what do you do to lift you?
That's such a good question, man. And a hard one too, because I don't think about that as much, to be honest. I feel like I get great satisfaction and joy and personal connection with people who I am engaging with. And I think that does lift me, but it can also be exhausting if I'm perpetually looking outwards and rather than inwards. And so I do try and take a little bit of time for myself every day to acknowledge what I'm doing and remember that, it is hard work, but, it can be impactful. I have a coffee almost every morning by myself in front of my fire. That's pretty lifting for me. And just taking that time by myself to be quiet. And even if my day is difficult or I know I'm moving into a difficult space, that the work that I'm doing can be impactful. And that for me is an important time.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's huge. Just the little things, right? Something that can become a routine that you just consistently do. Thank you for that. So I'm just going to wrap it up a little bit with the fact that our next episode, which is our last one for season 2, is going to be on April 19th. I also want to mention that Heather has offered to do a giveaway of one of her books. So if you would like to be entered into the draw for her Shadows and Light book, you'll just respond to our newsletter. So you'll have to sign up if you're not signed up. Respond to our newsletter, let's say by the end of March. Is that okay to do that? And then we'll send out the winner. And then Heather, thank you so much for your time with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.